Samford University, who will be talking with us today. I'm so excited that she's talking about early Christian art. And so with that, I'm going to simply give it to Shannon so that she can fill the rest of the time and inspire us and enlighten us. Thank you, Shannon, for being here.
I am so pleased to be here, and I think everyone can hear me okay. Yes, I always love to get straight into the material culture. I'm in art history and archaeology is, to me, always the focus, much more than myself. And very, very briefly, this morning I am so excited to share with you what may or may not be familiar, but it's at least a chance to look together at some of our earliest Christian art. And I think even folks with only a passing familiarity with the time period, and I'll do this in my classroom and ask students, okay, who was the first Christian emperor? And they can almost always say, well, Constantine. And Christian may be in apostrophes. We don't know the, faithfulness of his conversion. He is most famous, though, for seeing a vision that told him when he was fighting rivals, which is always an interesting juxtaposition. He's told when he's going in to slaughter his enemies, he should do so in the sign of the cross. But he does, or at least his posthumous biographers tell us that he does, and being successful in using the symbolism of Christianity. After he becomes sole emperor of the Roman Empire after the battle in 312 of the Milvian Bridge, he will issue an official edict, the so-called Edict of Milan in 313, that really it grants religious freedom to Romans. Doesn't make Christianity the official or only religion of the Roman Empire, but allows its unprosecuted, unhindered practice from that point forward. So it joins all the other religions in the Roman Empire available to its citizens. Starting there, because I think a lot of times when we think about early Christianity, Constantine, of course, comes to mind, and that support, because he does then officially support Christianity in many ways, seems a starting point, but no surprise to any of us that by that point in time, early 4th century, there have been Christians practicing Christianity for over 200 years. So it's not new, and it doesn't start with Constantine. From the middle of the 1st century, we can follow a lot with written evidence, so text, the spread of Christianity. This is a good map from the dark blue sites all the way to the Middle Ages with the kind of medium blue, Scandinavia staying the outpost until much later. And the spread, not surprisingly, again, I think from urban spots, from the cities, out into the countryside and other parts of the Roman Empire. But when you go looking for evidence from the beginning, so if we are thinking the life of Jesus and then of his apostles in the first half of the 1st century, we do have a little bit, again, of textual evidence, and especially the stories of Paul's travels. So we know sites where he found Christian populations. But and while text is an artifact, I'm a material culture person. I love to see those values displayed in art and architecture, really tangible expressions of what, for the Roman Empire, is going to be one of the biggest ideological changes it will undergo. Because, of course, and this map demonstrates that well, Christianity, it's a Roman religion, and it spreads in the Roman world by people in the Roman Empire, largely using the infrastructure of the Roman Empire. But I think also, not surprisingly, when you go back that early and you start looking for the material evidence, it's scattered for a lot of reasons. Folks are just getting started and decisions have to be made. How are we going to do this? Not just in terms of core belief, but in physical expressions. And while the persecution of Christianity in the Roman world, it was never constant, it was never universal, it still did happen. It happened at certain times, in certain places. But when it did, as you know, it was fairly harsh in these sporadic persecutions. So it also wasn't always safe for these believers to physically express themselves or bring public attention. And so when you go back and you want early evidence, it's really hard to find anything certain in the first 100 years. And that's, to me, interesting, because we know there are people who are practicing that faith wholeheartedly. One of our earliest, I'm going to start with it, and I do share it regularly anytime I'm talking about early Christian art, and I know that it's a hard one to see. I know that it is. It is an example of graffiti, and it comes from Rome, and it may date as early as the year 200. And that may not seem really early for Christianity, but for its physical expression, it is. And it is, if we're correct in interpreting it, and this is always also an issue, it is not a flattering view. It is not a flattering view. There's a Greek inscription. It was found on a wall on the Palatine Hill in Rome, and it shows a human figure on the left, identified as Alexamenos, a Greek name, right below a figure on a cross that's shown with a horse's or a donkey's head here. So it's definitely a pejorative, if it even has anything to do with Christianity. Now, there's enough there to make it highly possible. But even something like this is by no means certain. When you start looking for the evidence, we always want something that's a little bit more concrete. And you have to go a little bit later, even further into the 3rd century, to find something where you feel like, okay, now we're on recognizable, verifiable ground in early Christians communicating with each other visually. And that is in the sort of acrostic that they began to use of ichthus. It worked well. The Greek word for fish, to give it Christian meaning and become a convenient, easy way to communicate, a shorthand for Christians to communicate with each other or just demonstrate their presence. And again, you got to have more, because there's a lot of fish graffiti in the Roman world, right? And just finding the right time period in the right place, even if it's fish, doesn't mean, oh, there's Christians here. We can really say that. No, you got people who are scratching out the representation of a fish. It could be bored fishermen. It could have any other number of reasons for it to exist. You need a little bit more than that. And that's an archaeologist's favorite word, I think, is context. All the other information that goes along with the material evidence to help you interpret it. So again, you can see here when looking at one of the earliest, this is about as early as you can get, the early 200s, the early 3rd century. And it's pretty simple symbolism. The fish in this case, the ichthus zonton, and an inscription that helps us see this as, definitely Christian, or at least leaning that way at this point in time. We always qualify it. can often find a symbolism in early Christianity that shows up when you feel like you're on even safer ground, when there would have been very little reason for any other community to be using that symbolism. Fish, a little bit ambiguous, but the Chi-Rho, the first letters of Christ in Greek, and often just the Chi-Rho. And that seems to be what Constantine has his soldiers display in the battle in 312, based on descriptions of what they painted on shields is the Chi-Rho. Now, if you elaborate it, you can put the Alpha and Omega, and you're even more certain about that. But we're already into the later 3rd century by this point, and this is what we have. So they're very hard to find these physical traces of these Christian communities. These tombstones, occasional graffiti show up. When you look for them in more solid forms, like where were they meeting, right? And we know from text, well, in homes, so you don't really expect when it's not officially legal to practice Christianity to find official houses of worship, and you have to go looking for more informal places. Again, when you go looking, it's hard in these early dates. One of the best examples of an early house church comes from Roman Syria in that site of Dura Europos, right there on the border. And the reason it survives from an early date, this house church, is purely by accident. The site of Dura Europos is part of Roman Syria in the late Roman period, was under siege by Rome's enemies. And Rome, this is not long before the fall of Rome, and they've got problems back home, so they don't really care to defend a far-flung Syrian town when they've got bigger problems closer to the capital city. So Dura Europos was pretty much abandoned to its own defenses as Eastern invaders came in. And one of the things that they did was they tried to shore up the walls that already existed around the city, and they built up earth along the defensive walls, covering up some of the buildings that were already there. And one of those buildings that just got covered, filled with dirt as part of the defenses, was a house that apparently had been used as a church. Dura Europos is sometimes called a Syrian Pompeii because of this covering over and rediscovery. And you can see there in the top right corner, there are remains of what was clearly used as a baptistry. So we've got some structures, but because dirt was packed against the walls, like at Pompeii, these really ephemeral wall paintings survived because they were covered up for centuries in dirt and the sands of the desert. And so this is some of our earliest painted Christian art. On the side wall you see there, and I always think when I go back looking at these early sites, what did they care most to show? When they were just starting out, what are the first things they wanted to depict? Because I think that gives us some idea of what was important to them to communicate with each other, what they wanted to share and focus on. And so here we have an early depiction of the women going to the tomb. This is a fairly elaborate. Some of the other images are a lot sketchier and aren't done with so much detail. I think it's easy to make out. Maybe you can see my pointer there. No. The Good Shepherd, or the man with the sheep on his shoulders on the left side. It's a little bit harder down in the bottom left-hand corner to make out those outlines of two figures. I always think, though, in Christian or even Jewish art, the easiest people to recognize are Adam and Eve, because all you need, even if they're stick figures, are two naked people who somehow managed to communicate being embarrassed. And then you know, oh, Adam and Eve, right? Adam and Eve. Sometimes a tree or a snake is thrown in for good measure, but I've never had a class if I can show, even the most indistinct representation of two naked figures, Adam and Eve. And that's what you have here. As I also, anytime I spend time with this early Christian art, and it seems enigmatic to us all these centuries later, and we have to do the detective work of figuring it out, I remind myself as well that you also, even as a contemporary audience to the art, had to know what you were looking at for it to mean anything to you. And it is a favorite truth that's trotted out about visual art. It's so wonderful to have that for populations who can't read, who are illiterate. You can share information with them even if they can't read it for themselves. And as an art historian and anthropologist, I always remind myself, yes, but you got to know what you're looking at, right? You have to have had the information shared with you in some way to recognize what you're seeing. Even if you couldn't read it yourself, you had to have been told the story. So with this depiction, Christ heals the paralyzed man. You've got to know that story for these images to make any sense to you. And that would have been true of these original populations as well. This is backup. The stories have to have been shared first. The ambiguity in some cases could also help protect anybody who wasn't a member of the faith or had, maybe malicious purposes. If it's public, you might not have to worry too much about that. And we do have, I just wanted to share with you, in Rome itself, examples of house churches. And again, I don't know that this is the same as covered over, but it's a reuse of a site that preserved an original house church. I don't know if anybody's been to San Clemente in Rome, near the Colosseum. Above ground, it is a medieval church. But below it are multiple layers of religious activity, and it's fascinating because going down to the lowest is actually a pagan site, a Mithraeum at the very bottom level, where the Eastern god Mithras was worshipped by the Romans. Paganism goes out of fashion, and they used the same site for an early house church. So we've got some Christian remains there, and then an official public church is built there. So the Romans were good, even when belief systems changed, of keeping sacred sacred. Special sites were special sites, even if the gods for whom they were special changed. They recognized that. And that's important to me too as well in looking at this early art, because when Romans began to convert and decide for whatever reasons they wanted visual expressions of this new belief, they don't start over everything. They use the same sites, they use some of the same architecture, and they use some of the same art and art techniques. It just has new meanings along the way. And some of our best early art is in these multi-purpose burial sites. The catacombs are often discussed, I think on the surface, as particularly Christian in character, but we've got enough evidence to know that pagans, Jews, Christians all used these underground cemeteries. As Rome grew and real estate was at a premium, above ground real estate for burial was very expensive and not always available. But if you could dig down, you could have a fairly economic way to preserve and provide a place for the dead. Digging long tunnels, niches into the rock could be repositories for bodies. And they could be very simple, little more than just an alcove where the human remains are placed, or some could be decorated niches, almost little rooms carved out of the rock with wall paintings that in a lot of cases, again, because they're protected underground, do survive really well. And sometimes I'll test my students. How well did you pay attention in Sunday school, right? If you throw up these images, do you know, like the early Christians would, what you were looking at? And I think some are easy. If I asked you all, who are you looking at here? Daniel. And I cropped this slide because the painters actually labeled him just the little bit of a cheat sheet here. So if you didn't know, although I always think Daniel, man between two lions. In this context, it's going to be Daniel in the lion's den. And this is, again, let me show you some of the choices for subject matter in this early art. Daniel is a popular subject matter who comes up, and I think recognizable. This one's tougher. I don't know if anybody can get this one. Yeah, but again, you have to know ahead of time, right, to bring that meaning. It is the woman who touches the hem of Jesus' garment in the hope of healing. Not labeled, though. No identifying information given in text. So you have to know the story and make that association. But I love the art because if you do know two simple figures recognized, brings that whole story to mind and its significance to the people who are looking at it. You just need that prompt in the picture. This would be tougher if it didn't also have the writing on the right side, the agape, the feast, the shared brotherhood feast in Christian community along the way. These are just a few examples. But you can already see in early Christian art, familiar like Daniel, but you can see them deciding on some favorites, some regular. And it's interesting to think why. We can suggest reasons, and you can help me on this one as well, that one of the most popular subjects that we find in early Christian art, and you can see the dates here really early, 2nd to 4th century in these catacombs, is Jonah. Why Jonah? Why? That's Old Testament. That is Jewish, but it regularly shows up in the Christian period. And we think it is not, I don't know that they are really doing, the painters here who get the job to go into these tombs to paint and aren't doing the theological work, but it supports this idea. Jonah becomes a parallel for Christ in that in his ordeal, he is 3 days in the belly of the monster, the fish, just as Jesus is 3 days in the tomb. And again, I don't know that the painters who show up to do this job would be aware of all of that theology behind it. They're just told, look, here's the story, give us a good depiction of it. But it underpins even these early images, and I love these little sculptures that also show up. Now, right time, right place, we think, then you can associate these with Christianity. I think we always have to say, we're pretty sure. We're not, 100% sure, but these little figurines of Jonah disappearing head first in and then coming out the other side, and what I always think is a remarkably like pig-headed sea monster here. He looks like a giant hog who has swallowed him. But when you start looking for it, you see it everywhere. And I don't know why, but I'm a sucker for sarcophagus art. I love Roman sarcophagus art. It's so detailed. It has these wonderful, complex narrative. Every bit of space that can be used is used here, featuring the full narrative of Jonah. He goes over the boat on the left-hand side, but the earlier part of the story is up on the right, where he's under the withering vine. And you have then these coils featured right in the middle. But just for good measure, I don't know if anybody wants to guess, there's a completely different subject matter in the top left-hand corner. Again, test your knowledge. What do you think that's shown there? It has nothing to do with Jonah. It is Jesus calling Lazarus out of the tomb, that wrapped body there, almost like a little mummy standing on the platform. And then the figures here as Jesus calls him out. Again, one of the things that's fascinating, 3rd century, so in the 200s, is probably the same artists carving the art on these sarcophagi, whether it was pagans paying for it who wanted their own mythology, or Christians who wanted biblical story. And it may have been the same workshop that families went into. The style changes very little, and sometimes the stories could be either, right? We don't know the beliefs of the people who paid for this sarcophagus that shows a young girl on her deathbed. Other times you can't dispute it. There's Jonah. Here's another Jonah stuck in here, along with making a comeback from what I showed you in Dura Europos, another early subject that shows up regularly. Jonah's a stand-in for Jesus, but when you go looking for Christ himself, in early Christian art, one of the earliest ways he is shown is as the Good Shepherd. So there, you see the figure on the right. We see it in catacomb paintings, in other clearly Christian context. One example, again early, a second one. Over and over, Christ is the Good Shepherd. And if, this sparks the discussion, how these early Christians wanted to see Jesus. How did they understand him? In this, shepherding role seems to be, at least visually, one of the earliest ways. But even this, while it can have a particularly Christian meaning, is a borrowed imagery. Ancient art dating well before anything to do with Christianity uses the same motif. Here is Hermes as the ram bearer, Kriophoros. The idea again in pagan mythology of a shepherding figure works well then when it's taken on in Christianity along the way. Another one. Another way that Christ shows up regularly is in an almost Apollo-like manner. In some of these earlier depictions, even when he is the shepherd, he is young. He's got this kind of luxurious hair. He's unbearded and regal. And in this case, you need clear context again to know that you're not looking at Apollo, that the figure should instead be interpreted as Christ, because sometimes there's very little difference between the two. So here's a wonderful Roman mosaic that shows Apollo as the sun god with rays coming out from behind his head. But with just a couple of changes, it becomes Jesus. Now, there's no change in the figure. There's no change in the medium. The only change is in that crown symbolism, from kind of generic solar rays to the very specific Cairo. And that's the only difference. But sun God and Jesus' light make that work. And he's often shown in this fashion. Just one example of another comparison that's often made. I don't know if you know Orpheus from Greek mythology. Orpheus is famous. He has a great gift of music, but he becomes sadly better known in the tragic death of his wife, Eurydice. She is lost to him, descends to the underworld. He is so grief-stricken that he can't play any longer the music that had so pleased the gods. So they strike a deal with him that he can go to the underworld to retrieve his beloved wife, but under strict conditions. When they return to the land above, when they leave the underworld, he's got to trust that she's behind him without looking back. He can't look back to see that she has made it out as well. But in his anxiety, he does. And she's lost to him forever. Greek tragedy. But that trip to the underworld, like Jonah in the belly of the fish, seems to have been a parallel that made it possible to represent Jesus as Orpheus. Not as popular as Good Shepherd or Apollo, but it does sometimes show up. And those are some of the earliest depictions. Jesus here, by this point in time, you've got a sarcophagus that's got all Christian motifs. In the Passion of Christ, from his arrest to his appearance before Pilate, who will wash his hands of the whole business on the far right, and the Cairo symbolism. And I love these little ivory casket scenes that again have a youthful, unbearded Christ who, while his narrative becomes one of suffering and that's distinctly Christian, he's still that very classical, idealized youthful figure, unbearded. And one thing that interestingly does not show up hardly at all in the earliest Christian art are scenes of crucifixion. Actual scenes of Jesus on the cross. They are very, very rare in the earliest art. The focus is a lot more on the resurrection than the death. So here is the empty tomb. And I like this one because it is the rare scene. There's Thomas, who has the opportunity to touch the side of Jesus here to give himself the physical proof he needs to believe. Or this ascension into heaven as Jesus literally climbs up a little hill behind the tomb and gets a hand up from God into the heavens above him. By this point in time, we are well after the Edict of Milan and Constantine. And I'll just show you briefly what's often considered one of these masterpieces of early Christian art. It is a sarcophagus, again, of a man named Junius Bassus. And we know because along that top cornice, there's an inscription that names him. And to show you how far they've come by this point in time, middle of the 4th century, Junius Bassus is described here as a member of the Roman government who was a Christian. And what would have been a death sentence only, maybe even a couple of generations before, is now no problem for a man in the highest positions in the Roman government. And then he can have a sarcophagus with a variety of scenes. Again, the easy one to pick out, Adam and Eve, down in the next to the bottom left there. you can always play the game, right? Here you've got Abraham's sacrifice, thwarted sacrifice of Isaac. You've got the triumphal entry into Jerusalem along with the rest of Jesus, Peter and Paul. The one that always stumps everybody is down in the bottom left-hand corner. And that's Job sitting on a dung heap. It's kind of like, which one of these things doesn't belong with the other stories? But it's a magnificent sarcophagus. I'm going to close this morning with another depiction, interestingly, of Jesus. It's a little bit later. So, Roman Empire fallen, but Christianity enduring and firmly in place now across the Roman Empire. But if we go to the foot of the mountain where Moses received the Ten Commandments and a monastery that had been established there due to the significance of the site, we find a different image of Jesus here. One of our earliest icons that will become a standard form of devotional image, not just for Jesus, but for Mary and other significant figures in Christianity. And I think this is the more familiar depiction of Jesus. Not Orpheus, not Apollo, but the teacher, and bearded, right? Mature, bearded, solemn rabbi, teacher. Although even the hand gesture that he makes that becomes so familiar is borrowed. Still Romans making this art. And doing it in a technique that they knew well. Roman painted portraits. This is a technique called encaustic. It's a wax-based paint on wood. And we've got a lot of survivals of Roman portraits from this part of the world, many of which went over the faces of mummified Romans, preserved well in the sands of Egypt. But this focus on, can't be a portrait, we don't know what Jesus looks like, but this focus on, let's make him a recognizable man here. Now, a special man with special divine properties, but interestingly to me, this, and I think it is a very Roman depiction of Jesus, when I thought, yeah, this is the one that wins. From contemporary days, this is probably our modern representation of Jesus that is most familiar. And I let the Google machine tell me, I said, contemporary depictions of Jesus. And I did a screenshot, and every single one just in this block on Google Images that came up was the bearded Jesus. And to me, that is the most Roman way to depict him in this painted portrait, and it is the one that endures today all the way from all those centuries ago. So that is the tiniest glimpse of our earliest Christian art, and I think it's endurance. It's endurance for all of these centuries later that's still recognizable to us today. So I thank you for your time this morning, and I don't know if it's time for questions. Or I can hang around even if we are.
Is there one question? The best question? No pressure. Yeah, exactly, Sheila.
Well, good.
Thank you, Shannon. Let's pray before we go. Gracious God, we give you thanks for the beauty of this creation, and that the creative spirit that you have imbued in us is a way for us to manifest the way that you tell stories through our lives, and how we are bound to your Son Jesus in life, in story, in resurrection hope. We ask all of this with gratitude in our hearts for Shannon and for all that is ahead for us this day. To your glory we pray. Amen. Thank you so much.
It's all fun stuff.
Yeah, it is.
I mean, I live with